Well, I said again that this is a rhizomatic network, rhizome, a notion from Deleuze and Guattari, and it's originally a concept from botany. The dictionary definition is as follows: a continuously growing, horizontal, not vertical, underground stem. You see, it's underground, it's not in the light, it doesn't have the character of Apollonian rationality, it's not vertical, it's a completely different model, so it's underground, horizontal, and it's a stem which puts out lateral shoots and adventitious roots at intervals. Deleuze and Guattari juxtaposed the rhizome, this underground structure that grows horizontally and adventitiously, with the tree, which they treat as a fascistic model, a model in which the 1 becomes 2, the 2 becomes 4, and so on, a vertically branching model. The tree for them is a vertical system of ordered relations between unity and multiplicity, which in some sense characterizes a classical understanding of political and human hierarchy, which they reject. You can read more about the rhizome in the introduction of the book by Deleuze and Guattari called 1,000 Plateaus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. It's enough here to say, in giving us access to Dugin's use of the term and its meaning in this context, that it's a non-vertical multiplicity without unity. It's rejecting the notion of unity, it's rejecting the verticality, it's putting its emphasis on a disordered, disorganized, or at least non-hierarchical multiplicity. Why this is important again is that it's giving us the post-anthropological ideal corresponding to the structure of postmodernity. This rhizomatic sub-individual network type is against politics, against the state, against the vertical dimension, against power. No ordered relationships of unity and multiplicity in a hierarchical form. It is against politics. But if you remember how we discussed in the first session, Carl Schmitt's view that attempted depoliticizations are still political, a war against politics is still a war and therefore still political. Well, here too, to be against politics is still political. That is why Dugin says that postmodernity is loaded with a political meaning and is a revolutionary counter-project, and not just the pure entropy of political structure, as he discusses on page 172. So to repeat, even though it is against politics, it's still a political program. Now that's important to him for the following reason. He says that if we add the postmodern project against politics to the classical schema that includes modern and pre-modern politics, so we know there's pre-modern, we know there's modern, and you might think there's no postmodern politics because it's an anti-political project, but then we say, but even what's anti-political is still political. So now what we get is the broadest possible spectrum of the political, and therefore also of political anthropology. That spectrum consisting of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. That is a big spectrum of the concept of the political itself, each with its own fitting political anthropology or model of man or the subject. Within this broad spectrum, there are two fundamental anthropological types. The first is contemporary man constructed by the political, which means owing his identity to the structure of the political. It's left its imprint on him, it's made its mark. And yet this man struggles against politics as such. As Dugin writes, he has his blog, he watches TV, he pretends he votes for the opposition. That is, he latently identifies himself with the destructive anti-state political trend, even if he lacks a well-thought-out, coherent politics. When confronting any integral political concept, he starts by saying no. His attitude toward it is very aggressive, as Dugin writes on page 172. So that's one type. The other figure is the political soldier, a personality that embodies the classical approach to the political with its friends and enemies, courage, daring, and the willingness to kill or to be killed for politics. That's page 172, 173. And whoever is not ready to kill and to be killed for politics is not a political soldier in Dugin's analysis. So you have two types. The one marked by politics, but somehow not really involved or engaged in it actively. And the other one marked by politics and ready to kill or die for it. The question for Dugin is this: given these two types, how today can we oppose, because remember, somehow the whole project of the fourth political theory is premised on the possibility of opposition to the status quo of postmodern post-liberalism. So given these two types today, how can we oppose the decomposed rhizomatic post-human android of postmodernity? The first type is not going to fight and can be ignored. Remember, he's not actively engaged. He doesn't really take any stance or opposition except for what he just by inertia repeats of what he hears. So he can't really be relied on to have any real opposition to the post-human android. And as for the second type, the political soldier, it would seem that we can set aside our ideological differences and oppose to the postmodern android, the postmodern man, the figure of the political soldier who's serious about politics and willing to put up a fight. So if you have somebody who's willing to kill and to die for a political cause or political ideal, maybe that can be the kind of person who opposes the postmodern, rhizomatic, schizophrenic network subself, okay, the post-human android. But Dugin says no, that would be a mistake. We could do it, but the outcome is predetermined, page 173. The anthropological space of the political soldier, he argues, is being occupied by the imitation of the political soldier, the pseudo-soldier. Now, if it helps to make this image vivid, you can think here of pseudo-soldiers of the second and third political theories, of neo-Nazis or neo-fascists on one hand, or on the other hand, anti-fascist groups with their flags and weapons and slogans and violence. It would seem, maybe, that these groups represent political soldiers who are ready to kill or to be killed for their cause. But on Dugin's analysis, they are pseudo-soldiers fighting for dead ideologies. To repeat, Dugin says that, in fact, the confrontation we're faced with is not between the postmodern android on one hand and the political soldier on the other, but rather between the undisguised, rotten liberal post-human and the pseudo-human, the pseudo-soldier, as he puts it. This fake, false political soldier claiming to fight for his ideas and his ideologies, for the second and third political theories, and even for the first, is not more than a parody. So you see, just as Dugin said earlier in the book, that although we can creatively reappropriate elements of the previous theories, we can no longer defend them as wholes. They're all dead and outdated in that sense. Here he says we can also no longer defend them through the figure of the political soldier. Stated differently, anyone fighting in postmodernity as a liberal, communist, or fascist is a fake. Dugin calls the struggle of the political soldier against post-anthropology heroic, tragic, poetic, and hopeless on page 202. Today, there are no political soldiers, he writes. All that remains is their shells. So you have then the rotten liberal post-human, as he puts it, on one hand, and the pseudo-human, pseudo-soldier on the other. And we clearly can't leave it at that. We can't be satisfied by that option. Dugin therefore suggests that we approach the issue in another way. Now here's where things probably begin to get a little bit strange. We're going to do so by opposing to the post-human, not the classical political soldier, but rather the non-human. Now, what should we make of that strange suggestion? Well, Dugin says that Carl Schmitt's notion of political theology can give us a hint, so let's take a minute to consider that. Schmitt has a book called Political Theology, and here's a little section from it which is relevant to what Dugin's discussing. All significant concepts of the modern theory of the state, Schmitt writes, are secularized theological concepts, not only because of their historical development, in which they were transferred from theology to the theory of the state, whereby, for example, the omnipotent God became the omnipotent lawgiver, but also because of their systematic structure, the recognition of which is necessary for a sociological consideration of these concepts. So this link between the theological and the legal, or the theological and the political concepts, is not just a historical evolution, it has a structural similarity that we must understand. So for Schmitt, for example, the theological notion of a miracle is structurally similar to the notion of the exception to the rule in jurisprudence. That's sort of what a miracle is, the exception to the rule of the natural order. God's mysterious, ineffable will can affect the change that is in principle not calculable. Here's how Dugin characterizes in his book the idea of political theology. This is from page 175. All political ideologies and systems are integral theological models with religions, dogmas, institutions, and rights of their own. That's why, in order to understand politics, one must regard it as a religious phenomenon. So he's really focusing in here on the structural similarity. Let me repeat, all political ideologies and systems are integral theological models. Since Dugin rejects the post-human option, he's rejecting that post-anthropological type, he opts to explore the non-human option. Again, a strange idea. What is the non-human in the context of political theology? Because he said we can get a hint from political theology. Well, Dugin proposes the idea that it is the angel. There's a certain hypothesis, he writes, that I call the concept of Angelopolis, the city of angels, or angelpoliteia, angel politics. That is a turn from political theology to political angelology. What this means is that the sphere of the political is starting to be controlled by and is starting to ground itself upon the confrontation between superhuman entities. That is, entities that are neither human nor divine. Now that's important, and it's going to require some thinking through. But I just want to underscore here that angels are neither human nor divine. We're going to need to think about what that means. Neither human nor divine. But the main point here is that we need an alternative to the post-human android and to the pseudo-human pseudo-soldier, and Dugin proposes the angel. His political angelology, he says, is, quote, a concept devoid of mysticism or esotericism, calling it a metaphor that is both scientific and rational, on page 176. That's a sign for us about what we should be thinking and what we should not be thinking when trying to understand his proposal. Again, the concept of political angelology is devoid of mysticism. Angelology for Dugin is a metaphor that we can use to understand, interpret, and hermeneutically decipher the contemporary processes that surround us and that are alienated from political anthropology, as he writes. This metaphor should actually help us to understand our situation. So it's not meant to be some weird idea with no relevance to anything. Angels, what are you talking about? Political angelology, I don't get it. It's actually a metaphor that is supposed to give us access to understanding our situation better than we could do without that concept. But as he adds in Appendix 1, he's not only interested in being scientific and rational and in understanding contemporary processes. As he writes there, we do not just study what exists, we try to affect it. Political angelology is therefore both theoretical and practical. It helps us to understand what exists, and it helps us to affect what exists, as you see on page 199.